Israel, a good guy, Palestinians, bad guys. And now, of course, for Muslims, that's very serious. They're representative of millions of people who are disgusted by Britain's complicity.
What does that level of, let's call it duplicity, what does it tell us about modern politicians and politics?
There was a horrible alliance, really, between the Starmer and the Daily Mail. Both parties are Islamophobic.
Why is the Labour Party so unaware of that electoral gamble that it may make if it alienates the Muslim community?
I think it's a marvellous thing, the independent movement. The two-party system doesn't work, but a few independents in Parliament, Leanne Mohammed, we know she's very capable. I see the Muslim community as being very British.
The general election has been announced, and at the time of filming, the first day of campaigning is well underway. For the past 14 years, the UK has been governed by an inept group of Conservatives who have now run out of ideas as they coast and career from one blunder or crisis to another. With this backdrop, it is now very likely that the Labour Party led by Keir Starmer will form the next government. Some opinion polls suggest that they may be granted a huge majority with a 20+ opinion poll lead. However, for Muslims and others who have been aggrieved by the party's stance on Gaza, such a victory may spell more of the same, or at least a Blairism on steroids. An authoritarian government that has followed a dysfunctional US administration into greater wars. In the most recent council elections, wards with large Muslim populations experienced a decisive turn away from Labour, and the Muslim Vote campaign has at its core the belief that Labour should not be the natural recipient of our votes. Our guest this week has been dismayed at the negative media coverage given to Muslims who place Gaza as a voting concern. Terms like fifth column and insurrectionist have been evoked to claim the Muslim vote should be deeply feared. Peter Oborne principally writes for the Middle East Eye, amongst other outlets. His books include The Fate of Abraham, Why the West is Wrong About Islam, and The Assault on Truth. Peter Oborne, thank you once again for attending this podcast with The Thinking Muslim. It's great to see you.
It's a real pleasure to join you. A very interesting time.
It's a very, very interesting time. Now, we're speaking the day after Sunak's surprise announcement where he called a general election. For those of our viewers who are outside the UK, it's within the gift of the Prime Minister to call a general election within a 5-year term. Can I first take your reflections on his speech and the surprise announcement?
Yes, I thought that he was going to go on until the autumn. Why did he suddenly make this unexpected announcement to have the election on the 4th of July, which is in about 6 weeks' time? He'd had some very good economic news, so that the economy has started to grow again. Yeah. Inflation has fallen, and I think he just felt it's not going to get any better for me. It may get worse again. So let's have a summer election. And I think it's fair to say it was a fairly maladroit start, but, he was standing in the rain. I don't make too much of that. He's going to basically run on what he sees as his record. He presented himself as Mr. Security, in a troubled world. Yes. Maybe. I don't personally think he's got a very good credentials in that field, but others may disagree. Yeah. One thing I think in the context of this discussion is the way he framed radical Islam. He put that into his opening gambit, and really fighting that radical Islam abroad. And I think I interpreted that as talking about Israel, Palestine, and at home. And now, of course, for Muslims, that's very serious because it's basically, it's my interpretation, but I think we'll see this. Israel, a good guy, Palestinians, bad guys. Yeah. And in this country, Muslims who are affected by the Palestinian issue are going to be portrayed as radical Islamists or bad guys. So that's alarming. I didn't expect this sectarian language from the British Prime Minister when he launched the election campaign.
So do you feel that the election campaign will be fought on a fear of the Muslim community, or at least activists who are pro-Gaza, and that's why he's evoking this radical Islamism in his speech?
We've had this language from Mr. Sunak and the Conservative Party generally, right from the start. And so we saw that in that when...
Zach Goldsmith.
Well, we've seen that going right back to the 2016 mayoral election, and indeed this year's mayoral election. Sort of the smearing of Muslims and representation of Muslims as terrorists. And then we had it very much at the start of the year when we got that very nasty business when the SNP vote on a ceasefire was stymied. And the allegation was put out there with no evidence ever provided that somehow Muslims were threatening the lives, or of MPs. And this became that somehow that these very bad people were interfering in British democracy. No evidence was put up for that. And then, of course, we got it again in the May elections, the local council elections, local elections, where there was a big move against Starmer because of his very pro-Netanyahu position. And that was represented not just by Sunak, but also by the mainstream press. There was a horrible alliance, really, between the Starmer and the Daily Mail. We haven't seen that before. The Daily Mail was out there pushing the Starmer narrative that somehow Muslims were sectarian. I think some of the briefing from Labour, hadn't it been that this was a great victory for Hamas, and the Mail was putting forward the same thing, so was the Telegraph. And so you had a shared analysis of the, apparently from the Labour Party, and also from the Mail, Telegraph, the far right now, I call them not the right wing, the far right Tory press, against Muslims who were concerned. And others, and many others, by the way, all sorts of people in this country, of all faiths and none, are very concerned indeed about the what many see as a genocide, but certainly the atrocities being committed by Israel in Gaza. And that, so in other words, from the Conservative Party, we're going to see basically a very pro-Israel, very anti-rule of law. We've seen the Tory party trashing the International Criminal Court. We've the International Court of Justice, and Muslims who are concerned by the rule of law, and the rest of us, by the way, who are concerned about the rule of law and concerned about atrocities in Gaza, are going to be portrayed somehow as anti-Semites, as terrorist sympathizers, sectarians.
I mean, I would like to quote from a recent article. So recently in the UK, we had council elections, so local elections. And as you quite rightly stated there was a barrage of very negative headlines about the Muslim community because there was a decisive turn away from Labour, and a number of independent-minded councillors were elected, as well as third parties, Green Party members, etc. And so you could say in your article in the Middle East Eye, far from being the enemy within, as seen by most UK media, Muslims who rejected the rotten two-party system in the local elections were voting patriotically and deserve praise. What do you mean by that, patriotically and deserve praise?
Yes. Something horrible has happened to British public life.
Yeah.
And I'll just give you one example of how. I mean, Maggie Thatcher was seen by many as a right-wing, unacceptably right-wing person. But when it came to this issue of Israel-Palestine and the region, she was never afraid to really lay into, even though she was a great fan of the Jewish people, great supporter of Israel. When Israel did something illegal, she would stand up for the international rule of law. I dug out this article by in the Jewish Chronicle, which was an interview with Maggie Thatcher after Operation Babylon, when Israel illegally bombed a gross contravention of an Iraqi reactor.
Yes.
Maggie Thatcher, you've got to obey international law. You can't choose whose side you're on. You've got just to go by the law. And if you compare that to the wretched position of Rishi Sunak, I mean, it makes me feel ashamed as a British citizen and somebody who's been very proud to be British and come from a very traditional British background. Military background, actually, my parents. That we have a British Prime Minister who's attacked the International Criminal Court for its very careful finding that it wants to issue a warrant for the arrest of not just of the senior Hamas people, but also the two very senior Israeli political leaders in respect of war crimes and crimes against humanity. And that is how the system should work. And it's been issued so many times in the past against African leaders, against Putin. There's never been complaints, but suddenly, no, you can't issue one against an Israeli leader. Now, this is a shocking situation. And we've had it with the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, the same thing. They've trashed that system. Britain's signatory to these organisations. And so we're turning our back under Rishi Sunak against the rule of law. And once you've done that, you're, as Maggie Thatcher said, you're moving towards anarchy. You can't pick and choose pick and choose your friends. Only your enemies can be subject to this. And so that is clearly going to shape the election. Labour, too. We've heard nothing from Starmer, the Labour leader, which is disgraceful, given that he, was chief prosecutor and he knows this stuff backwards. David Lemmy, on the other hand, to his great credit, stood up in the House of Commons and stood up for the ICC. And I take my hat off to him. He was speaking the voice of what Maggie Thatcher would have said.
Right. Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, in that article, you also talk about the two-party system and how Muslims are, in a way, organizing themselves against that two-party system. I mean, what is it? What is the problem with the two-party system in your mind in the UK?
It's very important because the two-party system used to work very well. I mean, particularly if you look at the immediate post-war era, where the Conservatives honourably stood up for free market capitalism, which involves the rule of law, by the way. It can't work without it. And Labour, without completely repudiating capitalism, argued for social democracy, workers' rights, trade unions, and public ownership. And you've got these great clashes of ideas, fantastically democratic moments in British history from 1945 up to the 1970s, 80s. I remember attending some of these debates. Maggie Thatcher really stood up for stuff. Neil Kinnock on the other side. I remember watching the late John Smith, Labour leader in the early 90s, up against Michael Heseltine. It was really fizzling stuff. And I was as a political reporter in the chamber watching this. But now somebody learned, it was Blair who did this. It was called triangulation. He learned it off President Clinton. That you actually did stuff. Instead of representing ideas, you were cunning. You tried to cut off your opponent's ideas or copy them. And you can see very much that's what Starmer's doing. He's shadowing the ideas even of the far right. He's just wanting to close down positions. He doesn't want to put up ideas of his own, and that happened under Blair as well. So the British democracy has been overtaken by technicians, political technicians, but they still need enemies, and it is the both parties find themselves able to agree in safety on that we are going to target Muslims, we're going to smear Muslims. It's a terrible situation, and I've been exposing that, as you may know, in my work. Yeah. I was the one who first exposed the Islamophobia, which was central to the strategy of Zach Goldsmith's election campaign in 2016. Yeah. I convinced Channel 4 to make a television program about the targeting of Muslims in 20 years ago. I made a program about the ugliness of the media. The media gets alongside the political parties, and quite disgracefully, Starmer has allowed this to happen. I don't know if you saw the Labour Files programs by Al Jazeera, which just set out this. I mean, really sinister conduct by the Labour Party against British Muslims who are not allowed to take part in British democracy.
Yeah.
And if they do take part in British democracy, they get condemned as sectarian or as enemies within. This happens in both parties. Saeed Abbasi in the Conservative Party, very distinguished cabinet minister, used that term. Muslims have become the enemy within. So the two-party system is basically a battle for what it portrays as the middle ground. In fact, it's the far right now often which is dragged towards. Both parties are Islamophobic. Both parties pay no price for this, but the victim of it is at the moment the British Muslim community, which I argue again and again represents the best of British values. I've been able to demonstrate that. The great thing about being British is we stick up for the underdog. That's what Muslims do. We play a full civic role in our society. Exactly what Muslims do. Family values. You go on entrepreneurial if you're conservative. Fantastically entrepreneurial. And yet, quite shamingly, both the major political parties have decided to appeal to bigots who are, it's not so much that they're against Islam, but they're against immigration. And it's very sad. It's tragic what's happening in Britain.
Peter, something I've been trying to work out for some time. I understand why electorally the Conservative Party really does not have a problem with this level of Islamophobia, because most of the Conservative base and most of the constituencies within which Conservatives operate are not really, do not have sizable Muslim populations. But that's not the case for Labour seats. There are probably over 100 seats out of the 650 in Westminster that can be impacted by the Muslim vote. So why, and the Labour Party would be most dearly affected by that. So why is the Labour Party so unaware of that electoral gamble that it may make if it alienates the Muslim community?
Well, it is in some way. It is in some ways aware of it. You've seen it with the, Jess Phillips, for instance. Definitely the Labour MPs with substantial Muslim votes have, Jess throw away her career, her chances of office by voting for a ceasefire, and so did a few others. Now, so it's not as it, but I think that the calculation has been made by Starmer that he must be alongside Netanyahu. I think probably the bigger calculation, he must be pro-American. I think that, and what the briefing I get from talking in private, off the record, to Labour Party strategists, what they tell me is that Starmer says that, I've got to be Prime Minister, I've got to work with the White House, I've got to work with Israel, I've got it on the world stage, and therefore I'm not going to criticize what is blindingly obvious are the illegal acts and atrocities of the Labour of the Netanyahu far right administration in Tel Aviv, and I'm afraid that I think it's tragic. I think it takes away Starmer's own moral standing. I think but that I think is the calculation that he has made, and that Starmer has made, and therefore he also buys into the idea, of course, that by not voting Labour and by getting agitated, campaigning, getting active, making the argument against Israel, somehow you're sectarian, and you get in Backstairs briefing, you get really horrible stuff. These are pro-Hamas people, they're terrorist sympathizers, etc.
Yeah. I want to zoom out a little bit and try to understand Starmer as a politician, and maybe if there are parallels with Tony Blair, because I know you criticized Tony Blair. I think one of your books, The Rise of Political Lying, was very much about Blairism and how this triangulation had led to be all things to all people, but also quite duplicitous. The Iraq War was a good example of that. I mean, I remember in 2020 when Keir Starmer stood for leadership of the Labour Party, he had a prospectus. I think it was a 12-point prospectus, 10-point prospectus, and he's probably reneged on every single one of those points now. I mean, nationalisation, very left-wing prospectus, I suspect, to win over the left-wing base within his party. What does that level of, let's call it duplicity, what does it tell us about modern politicians and politics?
So I think that Keir Starmer is mesmerised by Blair. And he talks to him, I understand he talks to him a great deal.
Really?
And why wouldn't he, actually? There are only two former Labour Prime Ministers, Blair and Brown. I'm sure he does talk to Brown as well.
Yeah.
And he takes his advice. So he uses they're following the model of the 1992 to 1997 Blair campaign. Well, Blair took over in 94 after the tragic death of John Smith. And that was to suck up to the Murdoch press, buy into that whole bent media political system, make Labour acceptable not just to ordinary working people, but to the billionaires' press, which basically shapes our national discourse. And I think it's a great pity because you don't have to. I mean, Murdoch ran for many years a criminal organisation. I mean, we know through the phone hacking. And actually, what Starmer could say, I don't want to be part of this. I want to be part of a new Britain. He really wanted to shake stuff. You don't welcome the big think tanks, these mysteriously funded think tanks, with whatever their agendas may be. We don't know what they are, but and actually have the courage. And you can seek to represent a different sort of radical, it's a kind of phrase, to be a radical government. John Smith hated the media. He wouldn't go near the media. And all these nefarious people who sort of twist the truth behind the scenes in order to be all things to all men. And it's a pity, it's a great pity that Starmer hasn't had the personal integrity. And you raised that 10 points. So to win the election, he had 10 points. They were quite left-wing, nothing going to shake, they're not going to frighten the horses, actually, but a bit of nationalisation, of taxing the rich, that sort of stuff. But he's dumped that lot, and he's now got five. He came out with them 2 weeks ago, a 6-point plan, which is it's nothing. I mean, it's just a sort of a series of platitudes.
Yeah. That's interesting. I want to move on to the Muslim vote and your prospects, what you see to be the prospects of the Muslim vote. Now, at the moment, the strategy seems to be that there are a number of independents that are standing in key Muslim constituencies, but also the broader strategy is to show the weight of the Muslim vote by probably voting for third parties rather than the two established parties, and that's going to probably harm the Labour Party the most. I mean, there are some within the Muslim community as well as some outside the Muslim community that see this to be a fool's errand. You're setting yourself up to be even further disenfranchised in a political system that isolates you. I mean, how would you see that?
I think it's a marvelous thing, the independent movement. You have the two-party system doesn't work. It's been gamed by very cynical apparatchiks, most of whom are unknown to the general public. on both sides. There's Isaac Levideau, a disciple of Lincoln Crosby, a sort of political strategist, appears to be running the Labour thing. There's somebody called Morgan McSweeney. We don't know much about him on the Labour side.
Yeah.
And these people are not really democratic. They try to kind of game the system to win power. They're not driven by ideas. And I think it's marvelous that we have a series of independents, some of whom I know, others I want to get to know, who are going to explode that system. I just remember, if you go back 130 years, the two main parties, there was the Conservatives and the Liberals. And the organised Labour did try for a while to work with the Liberals, but ultimately they had to break away and form the Labour Party. To begin with, there was only a few, Keir Hardie and people like that, but eventually it became a full political party. I'm not saying that's going to happen, but you've got sometime the two-party system, Liberals and Conservatives, were not delivering for the working man. Now, we have a situation where the two-party system has utterly failed on foreign policy, again and again. On the invasion of Iraq, the war of an illegal war of aggression, which British state became part of, totally catastrophic. That was supported by both the main two political parties. Libya, another example, that calamity. And now I find it so shocking that the two major courts of the world, the ICJ and the ICC, have been completely clear about what's going on in Gaza, and they're rejected by, the ICJ was rejected by both parties. It's not quite clear at the moment where Labour stands, because, as I said, I hear David Lammy made some very encouraging remarks, but not Starmer.
Yeah.
So, but up till then, though, we had a sort of cross-party collaboration. We've had a cross-party collaboration on Gaza. Now, and many other things. Basically, Starmer has shaped Labour policy to be as much like the Tories in order to frighten the horses. Now, so we got these independents. I hope some of them will win. Andrew Feinstein, I know quite well. I very much hope he scares the living daylights electorally out of Starmer. Because Starmer has been so cynical. He deserves to be challenged. I know lots of constituents who feel terribly of Mr. Starmer, or Sir Keir Starmer, I should say, who feel utterly despaired. They're Labour voters, traditional Labour voters, who just feel that he's taken them for granted. And Feinstein is a remarkable figure, actually, Jewish. He's a former member of the ANC. He was veteran anti-apartheid, deeply principled. I think in Ilford North, Leanne Mohammed looks incredibly impressive to me. I'd love to talk to her. I think there are a number of very, very impressive people in the east end of London. Then, of course, you go north. People who are going to make a case against the two-party system has been gamed by political strategists funded by big money. We don't know who the big money is, and we don't know who the political strategists are, in order not to win the great battle of ideas, but win power for somebody who's bought and paid for. That is and so it's fantastic. It's a great democratic moment, as it was. May elections, great democratic moment. The billionaire press is really going to go after you. You'll get the Muslim candidates and the non-Muslim, the independent candidates are going to be pilloried as sectarian, anti-British. Actually, again and again, you, the Muslims, and the other independents, like my friend Mr. Feinstein, are fantastically British. This is the British radical tradition at work. There's a fabulous book by A.J.P. Taylor, I often refer to it, called The Troublemakers. The tradition of standing up, for virtue, for truth, for freedom, for decency, for tolerance, against the authoritarian nature of the state. It's a fantastic. It was the Ford Lectures at Oxford University in 1956, and it looks at the tradition from Tom Paine to Cobbett to Bright to Keir Hardie, right up to Tony. Well, it doesn't get you to Tony. It stops because it's 56, but it's obviously taken on later by Tony Benn, Jeremy Corbyn, and that is a very, very British, wonderful tradition, which we all, even people who are conservatives, ought to at least recognise as being something which has made us a wonderful country.
There's an argument that suggests that, okay, Gaza is a terrible situation, but when it comes to general elections, why make a foreign policy issue, which both political parties are united on anyway, so there's no real prospect that a prime minister will come along who's more favourable to your cause? Why make Gaza the hill to die on? There are many Muslims in Britain. I mean, we are socioeconomically still at the lowest ebbs of many of our communities. At least child poverty remains a big issue, and welfare services disproportionately harm communities like the Muslim community. And so I suppose the argument goes that Muslims should abandon the Gaza cause or the genocide that's taking place in Gaza, and at least vote on issues which are more closer to home. And that is somewhat persuasive to some Muslim communities who see the endemic problems of the last 14 years of a conservative government in their communities. So how should, in your mind, as someone who's, I think is a very strong friend of the Muslim community, how should we weigh up these concerns when thinking about voting?
By the way, this isn't just an issue for Muslims.
No.
It's an issue, I'm naturally a conservative voter, but I'm disgusted by this conservative government, and it's amazingly important that we get rid of them, the corruption, the lying, the greed, the cronyism, the incompetence, the culture wars, which they've cynically deployed, and the hatred of law and order. The way in which they. It's been a revolting government. I think this has been the worst government, particularly since Johnson turned up, Britain has ever had.
Yeah,
I put it as strongly as that. So I want to get rid of them, and therefore, should I vote for Keir Starmer? And it's a good question.
Yeah.
I think there are several answers. One is it's a very honourable position, the one you set out. You want to deal with child poverty, whatever it may be, and you think Labour's going to be better at it. These are real. Actually, do they offer much different? I would ask that question.
Yeah, that's true.
Basically, they don't challenge the social economic foundations of the Tory state. Yeah. But maybe this is a bit. I think Labour will win, and it's important to give a shock to the system. I would think it would, it's not impossible. It's very unlikely that Starmer could be ousted by Feinstein, who's a very charismatic and articulate candidate.
Yeah.
But a few independents in Parliament articulating the foreign policy position. And it's not, there'll be other wars coming along. You can be, unfortunately, quite certain of that. Yeah. Would be wonderful. And, Leanne Mohammed, we know she's very capable. There are all kinds, I got all kinds of other, there was a Jeremy Corbyn, I think, in Islington North.
Yeah.
Because they're not just representative of a small number of people, they're representative of millions of people who are disgusted by Britain's complicity. Yeah. And I think that's undeniable. It's not a controversial in war crimes, and our hostility, Britain's hostility towards the international rule of law. Yeah. And I think these are grave matters, and it is entirely proper that they should be affect the way people vote in a general election, but which does not mean that if a person, Muslim or not, makes a decision that in their constituency actually there are other issues, and they're going to vote on that. I'm not going to say don't do that. That's wholly honourable, and it's not for me to cast your vote for you.
I suppose the argument goes that if we can collectively reduce the majority of the Labour Party, I know it's an imprecise science, but if we can reduce that majority, they will win. But the smaller the majority, Tony Blair was able to do what he did. I think within 10 years, he only lost 4 divisions in the House of Commons, and that shows how strong and unassailable he was as a prime minister. Is that a strong enough political argument to make?
I think that is another very good point, that very big majorities can be very dangerous to democracy. Quentin Hogg, he talks about elective dictatorships. And the idea of Starmer, who has shown authoritarian tendencies, to put it mildly, with a massive majority, is a bit frightening. It's very frightening. And I think that if he had a small majority, with a cheerful number of independents, able to articulate what caused trouble for him, I think that would be a fantastic thing. And maybe they'd be supported by the Scott Nats and by the Lib Dems, and we can have a base for supporting British traditional liberties, for opposing Islamophobia, things like the prevent strategy. I mean, that's something we haven't talked about, but it's a very important issue. Is Starmer going to buy into this sort of architecture of which almost defines Muslims as subversive, prevent these weird czars of various kinds. Lord Wolney's political violence man, who's funded by the arms industry, and I believe, and then Lord Shawcross, given all sorts of, it's William Shawcross, I think he's a peer now, given all kinds of powers of judgment over what is an extremist. The use of the state to police how people think is one of the very sinister developments of recent years. And I hope that Starmer would not want Robin Simcox, for instance, as Commissioner for Counter-Extremism. I think, this is a man who was appointed by Suella Braverman and seems very one-sided in his judgments. I mean, I would have hoped that this kind of architecture of coercive liberalism might be challenged by an incoming Labour government. Now, whether or not Starmer has an appetite to do that, we don't know, do we? Yeah. Probably not.
Yeah. No, that's really interesting. The student encampments we're seeing around the world, but also we're seeing now in some elite universities here in the UK. Oxford, Cambridge have them. UCL, King's have started. LSE, I saw a student encampment. I mean, what are your thoughts about that movement?
Well, generally speaking, I think it's marvellous, and obviously, if they shouldn't get violent, they shouldn't use anti-Semitic or other slogans which are against the law.
Yeah.
But the tradition of student protest is a great one.
Yeah.
And my feeling is they're greatly misrepresented, and I don't like the sort of this new legislation which is being introduced, which seems to really make protest almost impossible.
Yeah.
And I hate the way they're being reported, the biased, fabricated reporting I've seen in the mainstream media.
One final question for you, really, and it's about, as I said, you're a friend of the Muslim community, and you've been writing.
By the way, I'm not really. I'm a friend of decency and fairness and tolerance.
Yes.
And I stand up for Muslims because Muslims have been subject to sort of smears, and you've been targeted by the state in a way which is very un-British, I believe. And I see the Muslim community as being very British in its, probably the most, Muslims identify with Britain and what Britain means, the multiculturalism, the fact you can be black and British, or gay and British or Muslim and British or Jewish and British. There's something wonderfully inclusive about being British, which means that it doesn't demand you have some identity, some particular British identity. We're not America and France, which you have to sort of sign up to all sorts of regulations in order to be part of the state. We'd be much more eclectic in our country, going back over hundreds of years. This idea that you have, which is that there is only one way of being British, is not a British idea at all. The people politicians have started waving the Union Jack as some sort of symbol. The thing about being British is very self-deprecatory. There isn't really, read Orwell on the subject, you can be British in all kinds of different ways. That's what's glorious about it. But you can be Muslim, and you definitely can be Muslim and British. By the way, they think about the way the Muslims fought in the two terrible wars of the last century for our freedoms. Thank you very much. But so did my grandfather. But we were all we're in it together when it counts.
Fantastic. I was going to say, as someone who knows the Muslim community quite well, I think you have a very good understanding of our strengths and our weaknesses. Of course, it's beyond today's topic to elaborate on these in great detail, but how do you see the Muslim community in the UK, its strengths and where we are and where we're going, and maybe some of the weaknesses we suffer from?
Gosh, that's quite a difficult question. And the strengths are, I think the Muslim community is very positive. It's very committed. It's got a very deep, when I go around the place, political understanding, but also I think the strength of community is very noticeable.
Yeah.
The strength of family is very important.
Yeah.
And actually, as a conservative, there's the entrepreneurial spirit. There's something which is very interesting about a lot of, particularly by younger people, Muslims I know. You actually got doing 3 jobs. Like you got some sort of day job, and then you're running a magazine in the evening, and it's quite extraordinary actually. The energy, and you're very involved. I think the community involvement. We're becoming a very Britain has become, over the last 30 years, it will not, in many ways, quite a selfish society. We've lost our civic. We're in danger. Some sections of society have lost their civic involvement, but that's certainly not true of British Muslims. And actually, quite a lot of the attacks on Islam are attacks on civil society, because it comes from a new ideology. It's called neoconservatism, which is very hostile to civil society. So if you look at the terrible attacks on the Trojan horse schools, so-called Trojan horse schools, which fabrications driven by Michael Gove, this is really an attack on Britishness, because that's Tahir Alam and the other people, wonderful, and many of them were white and Christian, who built those, turned around those schools. They were serving a community, and somehow they weren't doing it in exactly the way which was being laid down by this incoming Tory government, and so it was an attack on civil society, which again is a profoundly British idea that we all, we look after ourselves through communities and have multiple identities apart from the state.
Peter Oban, it's been a fascinating conversation. Thank you very much for your time.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for helping me think through some of these really important questions.
Thank you. Thanks. Please remember to subscribe to our social media and YouTube channels, and head over to our website thinkinmuslim.com to sign up to my weekly newsletter. Jazakallah khair.